Operation Epic Fury Update. President Donald J. Trump. Is this Bible prophecy? President Donald Trump just gave an update on Operation Epic Fury. You will be shocked by 5 facts about this. Number 1. The Trump update that reframed everything. Most people were still asking the basic question, are we at war with Iran? And then President Trump stepped to the podium. The address was delivered from the White House, roughly 36 hours after the first missiles launched. And within the first 2 minutes, it became clear that this was not a standard presidential update on a military operation. The first section was scale. The president described the operation as one of the largest, most complex, most overwhelming military offensives the world has ever seen. He detailed the breadth of what had been struck in just 36 hours. Hundreds of targets across Iranian territory. He described the destruction of Iranian naval assets with specific numbers. 9 warships and a naval building destroyed in a matter of literally minutes. He spoke of air defense systems neutralized, command centers eliminated, and missile sites struck with weapons designed to penetrate the deepest underground bunkers Iran had built. The message of this section was unmistakable. This was not proportional. This was not measured. This was overwhelming. And it was designed to send a signal to Iran, to the region, and to the world that the United States had committed to a scale of force that could not be mistaken for a warning shot. The second section was personal, and it was the most emotionally devastating moment in the entire address. The president paused, his tone shifted, and he spoke about the American service members who had already been killed. At that point, 3 had been confirmed dead by CENTCOM. Others were wounded, some seriously. And the president said something that hung in the air with a weight that no amount of military triumphalism could lift. There will likely be more before it ends. That single sentence changed the texture of the speech, because up to that point, the address had been about power, what America had done, what America could do, what America would continue doing. But that sentence was about cost, and it acknowledged, in a way that no commander-in-chief can avoid, that the price of this operation would be paid in American blood. He asked for prayers for the fallen and their families. He pledged to avenge their loss. And then he moved forward, because the speech had a destination, and he was not finished. The third section was historical framing, and this is where the scope of the address expanded beyond the immediate military campaign into something much larger. The president placed the operation in the context of nearly 5 decades of Iranian hostility toward the United States and Israel. He cited the 1979 hostage crisis. He cited the funding of terrorist organizations that have killed Americans in Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and across the world. He cited the regime's chants of death to America and death to Israel, not as rhetoric, but as policy. He cited the estimated 30,000 Iranian protesters, and he framed Operation Epic Fury not as a new conflict, but as the culmination of a confrontation that began in 1979 and had been allowed to fester, escalate, and metastasize for 47 years. The language places this conflict in a moral context that transcends the tactical. It says, this is not about missiles and centrifuges. This is about good versus evil, right versus wrong, civilization versus barbarism. And when a wartime leader uses that kind of language, the conflict takes on a dimension that purely military analysis cannot contain. The fourth section was the confirmation of Khamenei's death. The president did not speak about it clinically. He spoke about it with visible satisfaction. He called Khamenei a wretched and vile man who was responsible for the deaths of Americans, Israelis, and thousands of Iranian citizens. He noted that celebrations had been reported in Iranian streets, that some Iranians were not mourning their supreme leader, but rejoicing at his death, with many of the remaining figures now seeking surrender or immunity. This was not the language of deterrence. Deterrence says, "Stop or we'll hurt you." This was the language of regime destruction. It said, "The old Iran is over. The question is what comes next." And that question, what comes next, was the subject of the fifth and most consequential section of the address, because this is where the president stopped talking to America and started talking to Iran. He addressed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard directly. He told them to lay down their arms. He offered immunity to those who surrendered voluntarily and cooperated with what came next. He told them, in effect, that their supreme leader was dead, their commanders were dead, their air defenses were gone, their navy was gone, and their choice was simple: surrender now or be destroyed. And then he addressed the Iranian people, not as enemies, as potential allies. He called on Iranian patriots to seize the moment. He described the operation as creating an opportunity, a window, for the Iranian people to cast off the yoke of the regime and build a free nation. He promised American support, not boots on the ground, not occupation, but support for a future in which Iran's people, not its clerics and its Revolutionary Guard, determined the country's direction. That is regime change language. It is not the language of a limited strike with a defined endpoint. It is the language of a leader who believes, or at least wants the world to believe, that this military operation is the beginning of a political transformation. That the bombs are clearing the way, not just for military objectives, but for a new Iran. A free Iran. An Iran that no longer chants death to America, because the regime that taught the chant no longer exists. The speech ended with a declaration of resolve. The president stated that operations would continue unabated until all objectives were achieved. He credited the military rebuild of his first term for enabling the operation's scale. He praised the warriors executing the campaign. But before we go to the Bible, I need to walk you through what the first 100 hours actually looked like on the ground, because the speed of this operation is part of what makes it feel unprecedented. And there's a detail buried in the battlefield timeline that most people missed. Let me reconstruct this for you in sequence, because the pace of events in the opening days of Operation Epic Fury was so rapid that most people couldn't keep up. And the details that emerged reveal a campaign far more comprehensive than most initial reports suggested. Hour 0, February 28th, 1:15 a.m. Eastern Time. The first wave of Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from destroyers and submarines in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. Simultaneously, B-2 stealth bombers, having flown non-stop from Missouri, began releasing precision-guided munitions on deeply buried ballistic missile storage sites. These are facilities built underground, inside mountains, hardened against conventional attack. The 2,000-pound penetrator bombs used by the B-2S were specifically designed for this kind of target. Hours 1 through 6. The initial wave targeted air defense systems, radar installations, surface-to-air missile batteries, command nodes that coordinate Iran's integrated air defense network. Suppressing these systems was the prerequisite for everything that followed, because until the air defenses were down, fighter jets couldn't operate freely over Iranian territory. By the end of this phase, CENTCOM reported that Iran's ability to contest its own airspace had been significantly degraded. Hours 6 through 24. With air defenses suppressed, strike aircraft, F-35s, F-22s, F/A-18 began hitting a broader target set. IRGC command centers, missile production facilities, naval bases along Iran's southern coast, port infrastructure, communications nodes, intelligence facilities. The strikes were not concentrated in one area. They spanned from the western border regions to Tehran to the Persian Gulf coastline. The entire country was inside the operational envelope. Hours 24 through 48. This is when the naval dimension became devastating. U.S. submarines launched torpedo strikes against Iranian warships. Destroyers targeted vessels at sea and in port. By the 48-hour mark, reports indicated that over 30 Iranian naval vessels had been sunk or disabled, effectively neutralizing Iran's navy as a fighting force. The ports themselves were hit, damaging repair facilities and making it impossible to reconstitute naval capability in the near term. Hours 48 through 100. The operation transitioned from shock and awe to systematic dismantling. Deeply buried nuclear sites, including Natanz, which had been struck previously in June 2025, were hit again with bunker-busting munitions. Missile production lines were targeted to prevent rebuilding, and the strike tempo didn't decrease, it expanded. CENTCOM described the campaign as building unstoppable momentum and projecting 4 to 6 weeks of sustained operations to achieve all stated objectives. In 100 hours, the United States and Israel had struck over 2,000 targets. Iran's ballistic missile launch capability had been reduced by an estimated 86%. Its drone capability had been reduced by approximately 73%. Its navy had been functionally eliminated, and its supreme leader was dead. Now here's what this timeline tells you, and this is what connects to the prophetic question later. This was not improvised. This was not reactive. This level of coordination, the intelligence preparation, the target packages, the logistics of intercontinental bomber missions, the submarine positioning, the carrier strike group deployment, takes months to plan. The operation began on February 28th, but the decision to execute it was made long before. And that raises a question I'll come back to. If the diplomatic talks in February were never going to succeed, was the war always the intended outcome? But before that question, there's something I need to address that most coverage glosses over. Because this operation has a cost that no presidential address can fully convey. Even in a triumphant address, even amid descriptions of overwhelming force and strategic momentum, there was one line in the president's speech that changed the tone completely. He acknowledged that American service members had been killed. As of the latest confirmed reports from CENTCOM, that sentence deserves to sit with you, because behind the satellite footage and the missile trails and the strategic briefings are real human beings. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, people with families, people with children who will grow up without a parent. Now, let me step back from the operational details and address the question that sits underneath everything. Why Iran? Why now? And why at this scale? The White House has been consistent in its public messaging about the justification for Operation Epic Fury, and the rationale rests on 4 pillars. Pillar 1, the nuclear threat. Iran's nuclear program has been a source of international concern for over 2 decades. Despite the 2015 JCPOA agreement and subsequent diplomatic efforts, Iran continued to enrich uranium, reaching 60% purity. alarmingly close to the 90% threshold required for weapons-grade material. Intelligence assessments in early 2026 indicated that Iran could produce enough fissile material for a nuclear device in a matter of weeks. For Israel, a nation roughly the size of New Jersey, a single nuclear warhead represents an existential threat. The administration framed the operation as the definitive answer to that threat. Pillar 2. The ballistic missile arsenal. Iran had rebuilt and expanded its missile stockpile to an estimated 1,800 to 2,000 operational ballistic missiles, including variants capable of reaching Israel, Gulf state capitals, and U.S. military installations across the region. These missiles represent not just a military threat, but a delivery system for a potential nuclear warhead. The operation targeted production facilities, storage sites, and mobile launchers to degrade this capability before it could be used. Pillar 3. The proxy network. Iran funds, arms, trains, and directs a web of armed groups across the Middle East. Pillar 4. The framing of historical grievance. The president explicitly cited Iran's 47-year history of hostility toward the United States and Israel. From the 1979 hostage crisis to the funding of attacks that killed American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan to the Death to America chants that have defined regime rallies for decades. The operation was framed not as a new conflict, but as the culmination of a confrontation that has been building for nearly half a century. Now here's what I need you to understand before we turn to Scripture. These justifications are political and military. They come from a government prosecuting a war. And while the facts they reference are real, the framing is strategic. Every government at war frames its actions as necessary and righteous. That is not unique to this administration or this conflict. It is the nature of wartime communication. And our job, as people who take both the Bible and the truth seriously, is to examine the facts clearly, without being captured by any government's narrative. Because the prophetic question doesn't depend on whether the war is justified. It depends on whether the war aligns with patterns described in Scripture thousands of years before it happened. And that requires us to step back even further, because this conflict didn't begin on February 28th. Operation Epic Fury was presented to the public as a decisive response to an imminent threat. But the reality is that this campaign is the latest escalation in a chain of events stretching back months, and arguably decades. In June 2025, the United States conducted strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, including Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo. Reuters and other outlets reported that key enrichment infrastructure was heavily damaged. Those strikes were framed as limited and targeted, designed to set back Iran's nuclear timeline without triggering a full-scale war. But the damage was not permanent. Iran began rebuilding within weeks. New centrifuges were installed, alternative enrichment pathways were explored, and by the fall of 2025, intelligence assessments indicated that Iran was accelerating, not decelerating, its nuclear progress. Through the second half of 2025 and into early 2026, the diplomatic track unraveled. Indirect talks through Oman and Geneva produced vague guiding principles, but no binding agreement. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu visited Washington in February 2026 and publicly issued 5 non-negotiable conditions for any deal. Conditions so maximalist that they were widely interpreted as designed to be rejected. Iran did reject them, and within 12 days of that rejection, the bombs began falling. The proxy dimension had been escalating in parallel. Hezbollah had resumed rocket attacks on Israel's northern border. The Houthis had launched missiles at both Israel and international shipping in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq had attacked U.S. bases with increasing frequency and sophistication. And Iran's intelligence services had been linked to assassination plots and cyber operations against Western targets. Epic fury did not appear out of nowhere. It came after months of tightening pressure and years of unfinished conflict. And understanding that context matters for the prophetic question, because the Bible doesn't describe a single night event. It describes a process, a progression, a world moving toward a destination. And the question is whether that process is accelerating. Now, here's where the story gets bigger and more complicated. Because the president's language in his address went beyond military objectives. It went beyond deterrence. It went beyond degradation. He directly called on Iranian forces to surrender. He offered immunity. He called on the Iranian people to rise up. He framed the moment as an opportunity for freedom and regime change. That language is significant because degrading military capability and overthrowing a government are fundamentally different objectives. One has a defined endpoint: destroy the missiles, disable the air defenses, eliminate the nuclear sites, and stop. The other has no clear endpoint at all, because regime change depends on internal dynamics that no external military force can fully control. And the administration's stated timeline reflects this ambiguity. Officials have projected 4 to 6 weeks of sustained operations. Some briefings suggest no fixed timeline, only laser-focused pursuit of objectives. Costs are estimated in the billions for the first week alone, and the objectives themselves appear to be expanding in real time. From counterproliferation to proxy dismantlement to regime collapse. The most dangerous wars in history have often been the ones whose objectives expanded while they were already underway. And the gap between "we will destroy their missiles" and "we will support their freedom" is the gap between a military operation and a geopolitical transformation. Where this lands will determine not just the future of Iran, but the future of the entire Middle East. And that future, the geopolitical landscape that emerges from this conflict, is precisely what connects this moment to biblical prophecy. Because the prophets didn't just describe wars, they described what comes after the wars. They described alliances that form, conditions that emerge, and a trajectory that leads to a specific, identifiable destination.